Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, which is very flattering. Just to say one thing, I'm actually not Deputy Chairman of AIB. I know it's been in the newspapers. I'm just an ordinary director, as to say, thanks be to God. I decided I better go and put on a tie to show a bit of gravitas in front of such a distinguished audience, particularly when I saw Peter Sutherland wearing the tie. I think somehow or other you sort of feel you're out of uniform if you don't have the tie. I was asked by Joe on a few occasions to speak here, and I sort of ducked it. The main reason being that I find it very difficult to keep my opinions to myself, and they usually get me into trouble. And of course, if you're anyway associated with the public service, the last thing the politicians want you to do is say anything that might be slightly off-centre, and they take a rather poor view of it. But now that I'm out of the public service for the last 7 or 8 months, I feel extremely liberated and quite happy to give opinions on anything that anybody wants an opinion on. When Joe was asking me what would I speak on, and would I ever come up with a title, I sort of identified, I think, with people who say, what is going on in this country? What sort of a mess are we in? And is there anything we can do about it? And have we any say even in what we can do about it? And I thought, well, you know, this country doesn't just belong to a certain select group. It belongs to us all. And I thought that a suitable title would be, well, it's our country too. And we should be able to have some sort of a say in what goes on. You know, I never thought that we would end up in the kind of mess that we're in. You know, with a vast number of people unemployed and with emigration back again with us. You know, after all we've been through, are we back to square one? You know, from the time of the famine to the time we got our so-called freedom, I think it was about 75 years. But we've now had this freedom for 90 years, so we can't blame anybody else for the difficulties we're in, you know, except ourselves. And we've kind of got ourselves into these difficulties sort of little by little. And I look back to see what sort of a country do we have here. You know, when the state was established, there were sort of 3 power groups that took it over, as it were. One was the Catholic Church. One was the remnants of the people who'd fought for Irish freedom, who hadn't eliminated each other and were still on the ground. And the third really was the public service, the civil service. Now, the church had enormous power for years, and you had the situation where even the head of state would be down on his knees kissing a bishop's ring. And you daren't indeed say anything against the church because they were really all powerful, and they kept huge control on us. And, you know, in terms of control, they even controlled our thoughts, because if you thought the wrong thing, you had to confess it. And if you didn't, you know, eternal fire waited you, and you would really get done in. And this was a tremendous control. At least it was on me as a young fellow, because I used to be terrified of thinking of anything that young fellows do think of. And, but they sort of blew it, and they're no longer the power in the land that they once were. But the 2 others are certainly very much in control. Now, leaving aside for the moment the political system, the civil service was really a follow-on from the British system. And I worked in the Department of Finance on and off for many years, and you used to see the old files. And the original guys who set up the Department of Finance, they were all British civil servants. And you would read in the file, "Dear Sykes, yours of such and such ult refers to mine of such and such inst," etc. And all the names, they're all British names. And I think they laid down sort of the formula for what's now the Department of Finance and the civil service. The British, I think, moved on. We probably didn't move on in the same way as they did. You know, they found other ways of dealing with problems. The mess that we're in at the moment, you know, how did we get there? It didn't just happen within the last 2 or 3 years. You know, we joined the Euro almost 10 years ago now, and we joined a club. It was the German club there were certain rules associated with the German club, and we just didn't abide by those rules. One of them was that the Germans didn't do big pay rises. Now, we had very significant pay rises over the years. When they went on for a sufficiently long period and all our costs, etc., got out of control, we devalued the currency and we started again. Now, once we joined the euro, that option was gone. We couldn't devalue the euro. And I remember being up before some Dáil committee where this thing was being discussed, and they said, well, what happens if in future our costs get out of control and we can't devalue? And I remember saying, well, the theory would say that you have to take the hit then on the employment level. You know, more people lose their jobs. And that, unfortunately, is what has happened. And people have been paid just too much. We also, because of the euro, we got away from the old idea of how much money you could borrow for your house. I mean, I remember, and it's a long time ago, when you went in looking for a loan for a house, if you could get one indeed, they would lend you 2.5 times your income. And perhaps if you had a working spouse, they might give 1 times the spouse's income. And that was it. Then we got into the euro, and this new concept of affordability came in. In other words, what proportion of your income could you afford to pay in return for your house? And of course, what this did, of course, meant you could borrow more because interest rates were much lower. And what did that do? Well, it did the usual thing. It just shoved up the price of housing. And housing and house building became an even more profitable activity than it was before. And even outfits like the National Roads Authority ended up having to pay huge amounts of money for the purchase of land. Just to give you some figures, in 1995 we used to build about 30,000 dwellings per year. By 2005 and 2006 we were building almost 90,000. And just to put this in some sort of context, in the UK, if you want to multiply our population by theirs, it would have meant that they would have been building about 1.25 million dwellings per year. In fact, they were building about 200,000 or less. And in the United States, it would have meant they were building about 6.5 million dwellings per year. They were actually building between 1.5 and 2 million at most. So you ask yourself, what were we at building this vast number of houses? And of course, land prices shot through the roof as well. And at the peak, land prices in the centre of Dublin were actually costing €10,000 per square yard. I mean, just think about it. Now, this was generating, of course, a whole amount of additional taxation for the state, and expenditure rocketed up on the back of this sort of unsustainable level of income that the state was enjoying. Now, you may ask, how is all this being funded? And, you know, I suppose we're all to blame. There was a great party going on. But it was being funded by the banks, of course. Now, if you had a closed system and the cash was just rolling round and round, maybe we might have got away with something or other. But what was happening, of course, and it wasn't terribly clear at the time, was that the banks were funding themselves largely through huge borrowings on the international market. When we joined the euro, one of the great advantages, well, there were a number of great advantages. One was we got much lower interest rates than we'd had before, much lower bond yields. But we also got access to virtually unlimited liquidity. At least that's what we thought. So the banks had access to all this cash, cheap rates of interest, no exchange risk, and they got themselves up to their necks in debt. And I remember that if any of you want to find out about the figures, you can actually go to the central bank reports, but I found it extremely difficult to find my way through those reports. And I asked a colleague of mine who actually has 2 master's degrees in economics, could he find his way through them? And we eventually came to the conclusion that the banks had borrowed somewhere between 1 and 200 billion euros on the international market. That was the level of their indebtedness. That's what got us all into trouble, of course, because suddenly the foreigners wanted their cash back. You know, people wondered about the Celtic Tiger. I had many people from abroad coming in to talk to me about the Celtic Tiger. How did we manage to do it? And I said, well, it's a bit of a mystery to us all. You better go and ask somebody else. because it is a bit strange. And the warning signs were there. I mean, the economists used to go on about the housing bubble in Ireland, and it was all dismissed. It was kind of put down to begrudgery on their part. And then people say, well, did the central bank do anything? They made noises, all right, from time to time. Now, I believe they may have said something else behind the scenes, which kind of hasn't come out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Then you ask yourself, well, what was the political system and the Department of Finance doing about it? And the answer is, none of us are very clear what exactly they were doing about it. It was fairly evident that things were going off the rails. I mean, we've become completely uncompetitive. Our prices had just become crazy. I mean, just to give you a few examples, if you go to a doctor in France, it'll cost you 22 euros. If you go to a doctor in Dublin, GP, it'll cost you 50 to 70 probably. And if you go to a specialist in France, consultant, it costs you, I believe, 55 to 65. It costs you 150 in Ireland. The unit of electricity in France is less than 8 cents before that. In Ireland, it's over 14 cents. So electricity is about 80% dearer here than it is in France. One of the great things that I've used as an international comparator of prices, and some of you may be familiar with this, is the 1 litre bottle of Gordon's gin. Now, you can, and I've watched the price, as I say, I've watched the price, and some would say I'm long on gin because I can't skip a bargain. But if you're in Frankfurt Airport, the full price of a bottle of gin is €14.90. On special offer, you can get it, and I got it there a few weeks ago, I think it was €10.60. In the supermarket in France, it's €17.50. Surprisingly, in some of the French airports, it's €20. In Dublin Airport, and this is for people travelling within the European Union, and that's an important thing, it is €28.95 for the bottle. Sometimes on special offer, I saw it actually down to, it was 25 recently. Now, what sort of sense does that make? Why is everything in Ireland so much more expensive than everywhere else? Now, you get kind of all sorts of answers, but none of them terribly satisfactory. And, of course, it means that we've just become uncompetitive and we can't devalue our currency, and we're sort of stuck with this. There was a recent article in the Financial Times by Wolfgang Monschau, and he was looking at the various countries in Europe, and the title of the thing was The Eurozone's Tragic Small Country Mindset. And he said, running the Irish economy is like running a very large business or a football club. Now, we all know what happens if you're running a football club and it doesn't work. You're losing matches. Well, something gives. And you look then at our political system, how fit for purpose is that? A democracy typically has a division of powers between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. And this is the so-called separation of powers. In Ireland, we have what I believe is called the fusion of powers, where the executive and the legislature melt into each other. And it's probably one of the few areas where you go up for one job, but you're really interested in another job. You go up to be elected as a legislator. You don't really want to be a legislator. That's a fairly boring kind of thing. You want to be part of the executive. So in due course, a number of the legislators become part of the executive, and once they've got that, they control everything. By definition, the executive controls the legislature, because otherwise they wouldn't be there. And we've seen in recent times a situation where you get, I think it was something over 20 pieces of legislation were just guillotined before the summer holidays. They can't have by-elections because there's so much important work to be done. And at the same time, you go on 3 months' holidays. Now, I was looking, just out of idle curiosity last night, at our Constitution. The Constitution actually provides that the Dáil can sit for 7 years, not 5, 7. But a shorter period can be prescribed by law. And I looked up to see where is the law that prescribes the shorter period, because I was thinking maybe we don't need an election 2 years' time, maybe we go for another 4 years. And in fact, there is a piece of legislation in 1927 which prescribes the 5 years. But I suppose a government could come along and say, well, we could change that piece of legislation. In fact, a one-liner would do it, and all you have to say is in section such and such, for 5 substitute 7. And given that you control the legislature and you can apply a guillotine, you could have it all done in 10 minutes. And we wouldn't need another election for 4 years instead of 2. So that would be a marvellous situation, and I'm sure we'd all be delighted with it. But one of the awful things about this situation is the private citizen can find it very difficult to get any sort of satisfaction for grievances, real or imagined. And you can get a TD to put down a PQ for you. But you get messed with this sort of phalanx of negativity, as I was saying, where you don't necessarily get any reply. You put it to the minister, and the minister said, that's a matter for such and such a quango. And then you put the question to the quango, and the quango says, we don't comment on individual cases. So you're back to where you started. So what is our great freedom? Is it just to vote once every 5 years on the basis of an economic forecast that's probably wrong, and for a programme of government that probably won't take place? And is that what it was sort of all about? Then you look at the civil service and you say, well, is this fit for purpose? Well, am I overrunning my time here? Fuel. We set up the NTMA in 1990 in the face of ferocious opposition within the Department of Finance. The reason was that the department at that stage, in terms of management, and by the way, the department and the central bank, because they were doing some of it, neither of them were fit for purpose in terms of raising money for the state and managing the national debt. So that function was taken away from the Department of Finance. Now you have to ask yourself, has it been fit for purpose in connection with the other economic problems that have hit us? One of the difficulties with the civil service, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, is that its abilities or whatever have gone down over the last number of years. It's no longer a particularly attractive occupation. Partly, I suppose, because it's got such a knocking over the years that you really want to join an organisation that's held in not very high regard. The other thing is that the bright sparks coming through our education system really wanted to do something else. They went into the professions by and large, and they became doctors or engineers or accountants or lawyers or whatever. And these were good careers. Now, in other countries, you would find that there was movement from the private sector into the public sector. That really doesn't happen in Ireland for all kinds of reasons, and we could discuss this in Kingdom Come. It does happen in the United States. And there was one prominent Irish American who headed up a very prominent entity in the United States. And I was talking to him about Japan. He was very pessimistic about the Japanese economy. And he said that, well, he mentioned, first of all, that he was now working for 5% of the pay that he had when he was with his previous employer. But he was quite happy to do it. He'd obviously become a very wealthy man. But he said that in Japan, he reckoned they lost the ability to manage the country. He said over the years that people who held top jobs in the civil service and in the political system, they moved on very quickly. You know, they'd be there for a year or two and then they moved on to something else. They were only used to dealing with an economy that was growing all the time. Suddenly the thing stalled. And he said they just didn't know what to do. And Japan has been, really the economy there has stalled for the last 15 or 20 years. You know, a little spurt every so often, but really not much moving. And you say to yourself, is this what we're facing here in this country? Are we going to stall for years and years? You know, people say they see the green shoots. Now, at times you'd want to get out your magnifying glass or whatever to find these green shoots, because you hear a little bit of good news and then you hear a load of bad news. So you say, well, have the green shoots been killed off by something or other, weed killer or something? And are we really going anywhere? And have we got a system that's sort of fit for purpose? And I think this is the great challenge that's going to face us over the years. Our financial system, in terms of the state sector, is, up to now at any rate, has not been in really terribly bad condition. I mean, people say the whole Celtic Tiger was wasted. It wasn't entirely. We actually did put some money aside into this National Pension Reserve Fund, and there was 20 to 25 billion euros in that. You know, a little kitty put to one side. Now, some of it has been used to assist in the recapitalisation of the banks, but there's still a lot of cash there. But if you look at our net position, if you take our total debt, deduct off the cash that we built up a big mountain of cash just in case, and deduct off the value of the pension fund, our debt at the end of last year was about 38%. Our debt-GDP ratio was only about 38%. Now, many other countries have a debt-GDP ratio of over 100%. So, at the end of last year, if you could just cut it there, we really weren't in that big a mess. But, of course, we know that in the wings, there's an awful lot of stuff coming in on top of us. We're spending far more than we're getting in tax. We have all the money that's going to have to go to the banks, and we have the NAMA thing. So I suppose looking forward, the scene isn't great. And the problem about running up the debt is, you know, they're talking this year about taking about 3 billion out of the economy. Great. And it has to be done, by the way, because that deficit has to narrow. The difficulty is the money that you borrowed for the previous year, you know, 15 to 20 billion, the interest on that is probably 1 billion. So of the 3, you know, you're not going to narrow the deficit by 3. 1 billion is probably going to have to pay increased interest. You're only going to narrow it by 2. And if interest rates go up, you'll be narrowing it by even a lesser amount. So the debt can kind of feed on itself. Now, we've been through a period of quite low-ish interest rates. We think they're high, but I mean, I come from an era where we're well into double digits. So 5.5% seems still a bit of a bargain. But we could end up with much higher interest rates, and then you have the debt feeding even more on itself. Now, the thing about it is, I don't think it necessarily has to be so. Irish people are smart. I mean, we've guys who've done extremely well all around the world in terms of making their way, being leaders in companies, businesses all over the place. They don't really kind of give something to this economy. Now, you have to ask yourself why. Because they do, I think, in other countries, in the United States, etc. In the UK, they brought in people into government through the House of Lords. I mean, they had Lord Mandelson, they had Lord Miners, whom they brought in, and they even had that quaintly named Lord, the Minister for Transport, Lord Adonis. Now, I don't know whether we've got any people like that we could bring in. But, and in the United States, of course, in government, they bring in a lot of high-powered people into the US government. And there's a very interesting book by Hank Paulson, which Mike Burns very kindly gave to me, and I've been reading it. That gives great insights into how the US deals with problems. Any time I've ever gone to the US, I've always come back really energised and saying, Jesus, those guys can do it. Why can't we get the kind of energy that they have and move things on? Why haven't we got the positive outlook that they have? And they do tackle problems. We, for whatever reason, don't seem to be able to do it. And I remember years ago talking to a German banker, and this was when they were doing very, very well, and we weren't doing so well. And I said, how is it that you guys can, you know, make things do so well, make piles of money for yourself and all, and we're stuck here? And he said to me, well, look, he said, it's like this. If we want a camera, we go off and we make a camera. He said, you guys start writing theses about it and discussing it and all. You don't actually get down and do it. He said, you have to get down and do it. Now, I think part of our problem here is we get bound up in endless amounts of process. And the process takes over. It becomes all important. And we lose sight of what is the aim of what we're trying to do. Where are we trying to get to? We don't really know where we're trying to get at times. We do initially. And then when we start out, we lose sight of that. And, you know, we end up in the doldrums. There was a book published there some years ago called Who Moved My Cheese? Some of you may be familiar with it. You'd read it in about 30 or 40 minutes. But it's really about guys in their comfort zone and unable to get out of their comfort zone. The consequences of sticking in your comfort zone and the benefits of getting out of it to face up to the new reality. I think that's where we have to go. We're in a mess. We can get out of it. We've got out of messes before. I mean, I look back to the 1980s, the late 1980s. I was having great fun. I was Secretary of the Department of Defence. And, you know, that job is a Boy Scout's dream. You've got aircraft, you've got warships, you've got tanks, you've got guns. And I was having great fun. The government changed. And Charlie Haughey came in. He said, "What are you doing playing soldiers?" And he said, "We've got a financial difficulty. You have to come back now and do a bit, give up your playing soldiers." But I saw the way that administration dealt with problems and how we got out of it. And it was a mixture of political drive, great drive within one particular individual in the civil service and a couple of guys in the private sector. And, you know, we got the Financial Services Centre and we got a whole lot of other things done. And we got the whole system moving again. It's something like that we need again. Now, will we get it? Will we be able to change anything? I don't know. But if anything is to be changed, the change, I think, has to come from the political system. It's not going to come, I think, from anywhere else. So let me leave it at that, and thank you very much indeed for listening to me.